When seven-time Formula One champion Lewis Hamilton receives a mysterious envelope containing a small wooden racing car and a final wish from his recently deceased grandmother, he discovers a hidden family legacy that will change everything. His grandfather Thomas was once a talented racer in Grenada whose dreams were shattered by sabotage and discrimination. Now, Lewis must fulfill his grandmother Carmen's dying wish to place this humble wooden car on the winner's podium, allowing his grandfather's dream to finally cross the finish line. But with his recent struggles on the track and mounting technical problems, can Lewis overcome impossible odds to honor a promise that spans generations? What he ultimately does at the podium will leave millions around the world in tears. Lewis. Hamilton stood by the wide windows of his Monaco apartment, watching boats bob gently in the harbor below. The evening sun painted the water golden, but Lewis hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, fixed on the weathered envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. The envelope sat unopened on his glass coffee table. The handwriting on it was shaky, but familiar. His grandmother Carmen's. Something about it made his stomach twist. Why would she send a letter when she could just call? His phone buzzed on the counter. Lewis glanced at the screen and saw his father's name. "Hey, Dad," he answered, trying to sound normal. There was a pause on the line. "Lewis." His father's voice was different, tight and strained. "It's Grandma Carmen." Lewis's heart dropped. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She's gone, son." The words came out heavy and final. "She passed in her sleep last night at her home in Grenada." Lewis sank onto his white leather couch, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. The room seemed to spin. Grandma Carmen, the woman who had baked him cinnamon bread when he visited, who had kept newspaper clippings of every single one of his races, who had believed in him when he was just a boy with big dreams, was gone. "I don't understand," Lewis whispered. "She was fine when I spoke to her last week." The doctor said it was her heart. It was peaceful. His father's voice cracked. "She was 88, Lewis. She lived a good long life." Lewis stared at the envelope on the table. "She sent me something. A letter. It arrived today." There was silence on the other end. Then, she must have known somehow. After hanging up, Lewis sat motionless, memories washing over him. Grandma Carmen standing at the finish line of his first go-kart race when he was 8, clapping louder than anyone else. Her small house in Grenada with the bright blue shutters and the kitchen that always smelled of nutmeg and cinnamon. That way she'd cup his face in her hands and say, "You've got your grandfather's eyes, a racer's eyes." Finally, Lewis reached for the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open. Inside was a letter written on pale blue stationery and a small object wrapped in faded cloth. He unfolded the letter first. "My dearest Lewis, if you are reading this, then I have gone to join your grandfather, Thomas. Do not be sad for me. I have lived to see my grandson become one of the greatest racing drivers in history. What more could a grandmother ask for? There is something I need to tell you, something I should have told you years ago. Your grandfather was more than just a mechanic who loved cars. He was a racer too, though the history books won't show it. His dream was stolen from him in a way that would break your heart to know. The small wooden object I've sent is a racing car he carved with his own hands the night before what should have been his greatest race. He never got to finish what he started, Lewis." Lewis gently unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small wooden racing car about 4 inches long. It was simple but beautifully crafted, smooth from years of handling. The wood had darkened with age, but the shape was clearly that of an old-style formula car from the 1960s. Someone had painted the number 44 on its side, the same number Lewis raced with. His vision blurred with tears as he turned the car over in his palm. It felt warm, as if it carried some of his grandfather's spirit. He returned to the letter. "I have one final wish, my sweet boy. When you next stand on the top step of the podium, and you will, I know it, I want you to place this car there with you. Let your grandfather finally have his moment in victory. Let the world see it, even if they don't understand what it means. There is more to tell you about Thomas and his racing dreams. More that I've kept hidden all these years to protect you. The rest of the story is..." Lewis stopped reading, his chest too tight to continue. He couldn't face whatever secret his grandmother had kept all these years. Not yet. Not when the pain of losing her was still so fresh. He gently placed the wooden car on his mantelpiece next to his first Formula One trophy. The contrast was striking. The gleaming silver trophy towering over the humble wooden car. Yet somehow, the small car seemed to hold more weight, more history. Lewis pulled out his phone and booked the first available flight to Grenada. He needed to be there, to say goodbye properly, and to understand what his grandmother had been trying to tell him all these years. As night fell over Monaco, Lewis packed a small suitcase. The last thing he placed inside was the wooden car, carefully wrapped in one of his racing gloves for protection. Whatever his grandmother's final wish meant, whatever secret his family had kept, he would honor it. He glanced once more at the unfinished letter on the table. The rest of Carmen's secrets would have to wait until he was ready. For now, he just needed to get home to Grenada, to the place where his grandmother had lived and died, to the beginning of a story he was only just discovering. Lewis turned off the lights and closed the door to his apartment. The wooden car sat safely in his pocket. A small weight that somehow felt like it might change everything. As his driver took him to the airport, Lewis stared out at the twinkling lights of Monaco. For a man who had spent his life chasing speed, time suddenly felt too fast. His grandmother was gone, but she had left him with one final mystery, one final race to win. And Lewis Hamilton never backed down from a challenge, especially one that came from the woman who had always believed he could do the impossible. The plane descended through fluffy white clouds, revealing the lush green island of Grenada below. Lewis pressed his forehead against the cool window, taking in the familiar sight. The island looked like a jewel set in the turquoise Caribbean Sea, so different from the sleek modern world of Formula One he usually inhabited. Welcome to Maurice Bishop International Airport. Local time is 2:17 p.m., and the temperature is a beautiful 84 degrees, the pilot announced. As the plane touched down, Lewis felt a strange mix of sadness and comfort. Grenada was where his roots were, where his grandmother had lived her entire life. Now he was returning to say goodbye. The humid air hit him like a warm blanket as he stepped off the plane. Lewis pulled his cap lower over his eyes, hoping for a bit of privacy. Even here, fans might recognize the 7-time world champion. A driver waited for him at arrivals, holding a simple sign with Hamilton written on it. Lewis nodded and followed him to a waiting car. "Heading to Grand Aunt's, sir?" the driver asked. "Yes, my grandmother's house near the beach," Lewis replied, settling into the back seat. He pulled out his phone to let his father know he'd arrived safely, then gazed out the window as they drove away from the airport. The road wound along the coastline, past colorful houses and street vendors selling fresh fruit. Every turn brought another memory, There was the small convenience store where Grandma Carmen would buy him ice cream. There was the beach, where he had built sand castles as a child. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, yet exactly the same. Louis reached into his pocket and touched the wooden car. In the brightness of the Caribbean day, his grandmother's letter seemed less mysterious, more like a thread connecting him to his past. He pulled it out, ready to finish reading what she had written. The rest of the story is something I should have shared years ago. Your grandfather Thomas wasn't just any mechanic, he was the best on the island. He worked on rich people's cars to make a living, but racing was his true love. In 1967, there was a big race here in Grenada, the Caribbean Grand Prix. Drivers came from all over the islands. Thomas entered with a car he had fixed up himself. Nobody thought a local mechanic could compete, especially not a black man in those days. But your grandfather qualified in first position. The newspapers called it a miracle. The night before the final race, officials came to our house. They didn't want Thomas to win. They offered him money to withdraw, a lot of money. When he refused, they threatened him. Your grandfather wasn't scared easily. He stayed up all night, carving this little wooden car while he waited for race day. "This will be the shape of my victory," he told me. Louis swallowed hard, the car suddenly feeling heavier in his hand. What happened next still breaks my heart. When Thomas got to the track, his car wouldn't start. Someone had damaged the engine overnight. The officials claimed it was bad luck, but we knew better. Thomas never got to race that day. 1 week later, he died in an accident at the garage where he worked. I've kept this story from you because I wanted you to race for joy, not revenge. But now that you've become who you are, I want you to know where your talent comes from. It's in your blood, Louis. I have one more thing to tell you. Before he died, Thomas made me promise that someday his car would cross a finish line. The wooden one in your hands is his legacy. Place it on that podium, Louis. Let your grandfather finally have his victory through you. With all my love, Grandma Carmen P.S. In the blue box under my bed, you'll find proof of what they did to Thomas. What you do with it is up to you. Louis folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. His mind raced with questions. Who were these officials? What proof had his grandmother kept? And why had nobody in his family ever told him this story? The car slowed as they turned onto a narrow road leading to a small blue house set back from the beach. Louis's heart clenched at the sight of the familiar porch where his grandmother used to sit in her rocking chair, watching the ocean. Several cars were already parked outside. Family members had gathered, aunts, uncles, cousins, some he hadn't seen in years. As Louis stepped out of the car, a tall man with gray-streaked hair rushed down the porch steps. His father, Anthony Hamilton, pulled him into a tight hug. "You made it," Anthony said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course I did," Louis replied, hugging his father back. They walked together toward the house. The front door was open, and Louis could see people moving around inside. The scent of Caribbean cooking, spices, rice, and stewed chicken, wafted out. Even in death, Grandma Carmen's house felt alive. "Did you know?" Louis asked quietly. "About Grandpa Thomas and the race?" Anthony's step faltered. "She told you?" "Entrefin, her letter." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" His father sighed heavily. "Mom made us promise not to burden you with old heartaches. She wanted you to find your own way to racing, not be pushed by our family's past." Before Louis could ask more questions, a young woman appeared in the doorway. His cousin Marley, who had grown up racing go-karts with him during summer visits. "Louis, thank God you're here," she said, pulling him into a hug. "Everyone's inside. We've been looking through old photos. There are some of Grandpa Thomas you should see." Louis nodded, following her inside. The wooden car sat heavy in his pocket as he stepped over the threshold of his grandmother's house for what felt like the first time again. The past and present were colliding, and somewhere in this house was a blue box containing answers he wasn't sure he was ready for. But Lewis Hamilton never backed down from difficult truths, especially ones that might finally explain why racing had always felt less like a choice and more like a destiny he couldn't escape. Inside Carmen's house, time seemed to stand still. The same colorful curtains hung in the windows, the same wooden clock ticked on the wall, and the faint smell of nutmeg and cinnamon lingered in the air. The only thing missing was Carmen herself. Louis was immediately surrounded by relatives. Aunts hugged him tightly, uncles patted his back, and young cousins looked up at him with awe. He was both family and celebrity here, the grandson who had conquered the world, but still remembered his roots. "Come see the photos," Marley said, guiding him to the dining table where albums were spread out. Louis sat down, carefully taking off his cap and sunglasses. His cousin flipped open a weathered photo album with a faded red cover. "Look," she said, pointing to a black and white photograph. "That's Grandpa Thomas." Louis leaned forward. The photo showed a tall, lean man standing proudly next to an old racing car. He wore overalls and had the same intense eyes that Louis saw in the mirror every day. Beside him stood a young Carmen, beautiful in a simple dress, her smile radiant as she looked up at her husband. "This was taken at the qualifying race," Marley explained, "the one where he took first position. Grandma kept it hidden for years, but she showed me last Christmas, said I reminded her of him." Louis traced his grandfather's face with his finger. "Why didn't she ever tell me this story?" "She said you needed to make your own way without feeling like you were carrying someone else's dreams," Marley replied. "But she watched every single one of your races. She'd sit right there." Marley pointed to an old armchair by the window, and cheered so loud I thought the neighbors would complain. Louis smiled, imagining his grandmother celebrating his victories from her living room in Grenada, while he stood on podiums around the world. His uncle Bernard approached, carrying a glass of rum punch. "Your grandfather was something else," he said, sitting down heavily. "Best mechanic on the island. Could hear what was wrong with an engine just by listening to it, like music to him." "What happened after the race was cancelled?" Louis asked. Bernard's face darkened. "Those officials, they ruined him. The shame of not even getting to race after all that work. It broke something in him. The accident at the EDT garage a week later. Some say it wasn't really an accident." "Bernard, that's enough," Louis's father interrupted, joining them. "We don't need to dig up old pains." "No, I want to know," Louis insisted, the wooden car a solid weight in his pocket. "Grandma left me a letter saying there's proof in a blue box under her bed." A hush fell over the room. Family members exchanged glances. "She kept everything," his Aunt Josephine said quietly. "Newspaper clippings, letters, even a confession from one of those officials years later when he was dying and wanted to clear his conscience." Louis stood up. "I need to see it." "Tomorrow," his father said firmly. "After the funeral. Tonight is for remembering Grandma Carmen, not old injustices." Louis nodded reluctantly. His father was right. There would be time for truth later. As the evening progressed, more family arrived. The house filled with stories, laughter, and occasional tears. They ate traditional Grenadian food, oil down, callaloo soup, and Carmen's famous spiced cake that her sister had prepared from the old recipe. An elderly man Louis didn't recognize arrived late, leaning on a cane. The room quieted as he entered. "That's Jackson," Marley whispered. "He worked with Grandpa Thomas at the garage." The old man's eyes found Louis across the room. He made his way slowly over, his gaze never leaving Louis's face. "You look just like him," Jackson said, his voice gravelly with age. "Same fire in the eyes." "You knew my grandfather?" Louis asked. Jackson nodded. "Better than most. I was there when he qualified. There the night he carved that little wooden car." He pointed to Louis's pocket. "I can see you've got it with you." Louis pulled out the wooden car, surprised. "How did you know?" "Carmen told me she was sending it to you. Thomas made that car as a promise, that someday his family would finish what he couldn't." Jackson placed a weathered hand on Louis's shoulder. "Tomorrow, after we lay Carmen to rest, I have something to show you. Something Thomas would want you to see." As night fell, family members departed or settled into various rooms of the house. Louis lay on the sofa in the living room, unable to sleep. The wooden car sat on the coffee table before him, its simple lines gleaming in the moonlight coming through the window. Tomorrow, he would bury his grandmother. And then, it seemed, he would uncover the full truth of his racing heritage, a truth that had been waiting for him all his life. Morning arrived with gentle sunlight streaming through the curtains. Louis awoke on the sofa, momentarily confused by his surroundings, until the events of the previous day came rushing back. Grandma Carmen was gone. Today was her funeral. He sat up and reached for the wooden car on the coffee table, turning it over in his hands. The number 44 painted on its side seemed like more than a coincidence now. Had his racing number always been a connection to his grandfather he hadn't understood? The house slowly came to life around him. Family members moved about, speaking in hushed tones, preparing for the day ahead. Louis showered and changed into the black suit he had packed. As he knotted his tie, he caught his reflection in the mirror. His grandfather's eyes looked back at him, a racer's eyes, as Carmen had always said. By 10 o'clock, they were ready to leave for St. George's Anglican Church. The small procession of cars wound its way through the coastal roads of Grenada. Louis rode with his father, both men silent, lost in their own memories. The church stood on a hill overlooking the harbor, its white walls bright against the blue sky. Already, people were gathering outside, not just family, but what seemed like half the island. Carmen had been beloved in her community. "I didn't realize so many people would come," Louis said quietly as their car pulled up. His father nodded. "Your grandmother never met a stranger. Everyone was a friend to her." Inside, the church was cool and filled with the scent of flowers. Massive arrangements of tropical blooms, bright bird of paradise, delicate orchids, and bold anthuriums surrounded Carmen's casket. A choir sang softly as people filed in and took their seats. Louis and his family sat in the front row. He kept the wooden car in his pocket, his fingers occasionally touching it for comfort. As more people arrived, Louis was surprised to see several faces he recognized from the racing world. Team members who had Caribbean roots and had taken flights to pay their respects to the grandmother of Lewis Hamilton. The service began with hymns Carmen had loved. The pastor spoke of her life, her strength as a young widow raising 4 children alone, her generosity to neighbors, her unwavering faith. Then came the personal tributes. Lewis's father spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion in ode and his eyes. "My mother taught me that obstacles are just challenges waiting to be overcome," Anthony said. "She faced more than her share in life, but never let bitterness take root. Instead, she planted gardens, baked bread, and raised children who knew they were loved. Her legacy lives on in all of us, especially in her grandchildren who carry her determination into the world. When it was Lewis's turn to speak, he stood slowly, feeling the weight of all eyes on him. He had given countless interviews, stood on podiums before millions. But this was different. This was family. My grandmother Carmen was my first fan, he began. Before sponsors, before trophies, there was a woman who believed I could do anything. She once told me that racing isn't just about being fast. It's about finding joy in the journey. His voice caught, and he paused. The wooden car seemed to grow warmer in his pocket. What I didn't know until recently was that my passion for racing is a family legacy. My grandfather Thomas was a racer too, though his dreams were cut short. Grandma Carmen kept his memory alive, and through her, he inspired me without my even knowing it. Lewis looked out at the sea of faces. I race for many reasons. For the challenge, for my team, for the fans. But now I know I also race for them. For Grandma Carmen and Grandpa Thomas. For dreams that span generations. After the service, as people began to file out, an elderly man approached Lewis. It was Jackson, moving slowly but purposefully, his eyes bright despite his age. "That was well said, young man," Jackson told him. "Carmen would be proud." "Thank you for coming," Lewis replied. "My cousin mentioned you worked with my grandfather." Jackson nodded. 57 years at the same garage. Thomas was the best mechanic I ever knew, and he'd have been the best racer too, if they'd given him a fair chance. "What exactly happened?" Lewis asked. "Everyone talks around it, but nobody tells me straight." Jackson glanced around at the departing mourners. "Not here. After the burial, meet me at Clark's Court Rum Distillery, the old parking lot behind it. That's where it all started, and that's where you should hear the story." Lewis nodded, curious why Jackson would choose such a location. The elderly man squeezed Lewis's arm once, then made his way slowly down the church steps. The burial was intimate, with only close family gathering around as Carmen was laid to rest beside Thomas. Lewis stood between his father and Marley, there, shoulders touching in silent support as they said their final goodbyes. Afterward, as family members returned to Carmen's house, Lewis made his excuse and slipped away. Following Jackson's instructions, he drove to the old rum distillery on the outskirts of St. George's. The parking lot behind the main building was empty, except for one old truck. Jackson stood leaning against it, waiting. I was beginning to think. "You wouldn't come?" the old man said as Lewis approached. "I need to know the truth," Lewis replied simply. Jackson gestured to his truck. "Then we need to go somewhere else. Somewhere that's been forgotten by most, but not by me. Not by Carmen either." As they drove away from the distillery, Jackson was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You know, Thomas used to say that racing isn't just about speed. It's about truth. The track doesn't lie, and neither does a well-built engine." He was looking for truth his whole life. The truck turned onto an overgrown dirt road that Lewis wouldn't have noticed if he'd been driving. Through the windshield, he could see they were heading toward what looked like an abandoned property, half reclaimed by tropical vegetation. "What is this place?" Lewis asked as Jackson parked. The old man turned to him, his face solemn. "This, Lewis Hamilton, is where your grandfather should have made history. The forgotten Grenada racing circuit, the scene of the crime that changed your family forever." Lewis stepped out of the truck, his racing shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. Before him lay what remained of the Grenada racing circuit, a ghost of a racetrack nearly consumed by the island's lush vegetation. Weeds pushed through cracks in the faded asphalt. Palm trees had grown through what must have once been grandstands. Nature was reclaiming what humans had abandoned. Yet despite its dilapidated state, Lewis could still make out the shape of the track, the sweeping curves, the straight sections, the pit area now covered in tropical vines. His trained eye could read the circuit like a book. "It's not much to look at now," Jackson said, coming to stand beside him. But in 1967, this was the pride of the Caribbean racing world. They built it for the Caribbean Grand Prix, a race meant to bring drivers from all the islands together. Lewis walked forward slowly, drawn to the overgrown starting grid. Faded white lines were barely visible beneath scattered leaves and dirt. "This is where he would have started," Jackson continued, following him. "Pole position. Your grandfather earned it fair and square. Fastest qualifying time by nearly 2 seconds. Lewis closed his eyes for a moment, trying to imagine it. The roar of engines from another era, spectators filling makeshift stands, and his grandfather, young and hopeful, sitting in a race car at the front of the grid. "Tell me everything," Lewis said, opening his eyes. "From the beginning." Jackson nodded and gestured to a concrete slab nearby. "Once the foundation of a timing tower." They sat down, and the old man pulled out a tarnished silver flask, taking a small sip before offering it to Lewis, who politely declined. "Thomas was the best mechanic in Grenada, maybe in the whole Caribbean," Jackson began. "Rich folks would bring their fancy cars from other islands just so he could work on them. But what Thomas really wanted was to race." Jackson pointed to a dilapidated building half hidden by bushes. "That was our garage. We'd work all day fixing other people's cars, then stay late into the night working on Thomas's race car, a modified Austin Healey he'd bought, broken and rebuilt from the ground up. When they announced the Caribbean Grand Prix, most people laughed when Thomas said he was entering. Back then, racing was for rich white men, not black mechanics from the island. But your grandfather was stubborn, like someone else I know." Jackson gave Lewis a knowing look. The qualifying day came, and Thomas shocked everyone. He knew every inch of this track, had helped build parts of it, in fact. He drove like the car was an extension of himself. When they posted the times and Thomas was at the top, the local crowd went wild, but the officials weren't happy. Jackson's face darkened. "That night, 3 men came to your grandparents' house. I was there, helping Thomas make final adjustments to the car for the race. They offered him money to withdraw, said it would be better for everyone if he didn't race. Thomas refused. Then they got nasty, started making threats. After they left, Thomas sat on the porch all night. He was worried they might do something to the car, but we couldn't move it, had no way to transport it except to drive it. And once it was on the track, the officials were responsible for security. That's when he carved that little wooden car you've got." Lewis pulled the wooden car from his pocket, looking at it with new understanding. He said, if they wouldn't let his real car race, at least he'd have this one, Jackson continued. Painted. The number 44 on it because that was his birth date, April 4th. Lewis stared at the number, stunned. He'd chosen 44 as his racing number because it had always felt right. He'd never known it was his grandfather's birth date. The next morning, we arrived early. Thomas was calm, focused, just like you get. Before a race, I bet. But when he tried to start the car, Jackson's voice trailed off. It wouldn't start, Lewis finished for him. The fuel line had been cut, and the distributor cap was missing. Jackson said, anger still evident in his voice. After all these years, someone had gotten to it overnight. The officials claimed it was unfortunate, offered empty sympathies, but we all knew. The race went on without him. Some rich kid from Trinidad won. Lewis stood up, unable to sit still with the anger building inside him. He walked a few steps onto what remained of the track, trying to process what he was hearing. A week later, Thomas was working late at the garage. Jackson continued, his voice quieter now. A car lift failed, came down on him when he was underneath. The official report called it an accident, but the lift had been inspected just days before. Was working perfectly fine. Lewis turned back to face Jackson, his stomach tight with dread. You think they killed him? I think they sent a message, Jackson replied carefully. Can't prove it, of course. But a week after Thomas died, the man who won the race had his car serviced at our garage. One of the officials was with him. He looked me in the eye and said, "Some people need to know their place." I never forgot. It. Lewis clenched his fists, feeling a surge of protective rage for the grandfather he'd never known. Your grandmother knew the truth, Jackson said. She kept evidence, newspaper clippings, photos, letters, and years later, she got something else. One of those officials, on his deathbed, wrote a confession, admitted they'd sabotaged Thomas's car because they couldn't let a black mechanic win their prestigious race. Why didn't she ever use this evidence? Lewis asked. She could have cleared his name, told the real story. Jackson sighed. What good would it have done? Thomas was gone. No confession would bring him back. And Carmen had 4 young children to raise alone. She couldn't afford to make powerful enemies. The old man stood up with effort, joints creaking. But she kept everything, waiting for the right time, the right person. She was so proud when you started racing. Used to tell me, Jackson, Thomas is racing again through our boy, but she never wanted your success tainted by bitterness over the past. Lewis walked the perimeter of what once had been the pit lane, visualizing mechanics working frantically on cars, drivers preparing for their moment. His grandfather should have been among them. There's one more thing you should know, Jackson said, following slowly. After your first Formula One win, Carmen came here, brought a small bottle of champagne, poured it right there at the start line, and said, "That's for you, Thomas. Our boy did it." She came after every one of your championship wins. Lewis felt tears welling in his eyes. He'd had no idea his grandmother had created this ritual, celebrating his victories with the grandfather he'd never met. Why are you telling me all this now? Lewis asked. Because Carmen kept this secret to protect you, Jackson replied. But now that she's gone, someone needs to remember the truth. And she chose you. He pointed to the wooden car in Lewis's hand. That little car isn't just a keepsake. It's evidence of a dream that was stolen. By putting it on the podium like Carmen asked, you won't just be fulfilling her wish. You'll be correcting a wrong that's been buried too long. As they walked back to the truck, Lewis paused for one last look at the abandoned track. The setting. Sun cast long shadows across the circuit where his grandfather should have made history. In that moment, Lewis made a silent promise, not just to place the wooden car on a podium, but to win that race, to make it the most important victory of his career. For Thomas, for Carmen, for a family legacy that had been waiting decades to cross its true finish line. The drive back from the abandoned racetrack was quiet. Lewis stared out the window, watching the green landscape of Grenada slide by as his mind processed everything Jackson had told him. The wooden car felt different in his hand now, heavier with meaning, with history, with responsibility. When they reached Carmen's house, several family members were still there. They looked up with curious expressions as Louis entered with Jackson. "Where have you been?" his father asked, concern evident in his voice. "Learning about Grandpa Thomas," Louis replied simply. "Too, about the race, and what really happened afterward." His father's expression tightened. "Jackson, you had no right." "He had every right," Louis interrupted. "This is my history too. I deserve to know." The room fell silent. Louis turned to his father, holding up the wooden car. "Did you know that Grandpa Thomas painted the number 44 on this because it was his birth date? April 4th, the same number I race with." Anthony Hamilton's stern expression softened. "I didn't know that. I always wondered why you chose that number." "I didn't choose it," Louis said quietly. "It chose me." Later that evening, after Jackson had left and most of the family had gone to their homes or hotels, Louis sat alone in his grandmother's bedroom. His father had finally shown him the blue box from under Carmen's bed. Inside were newspaper clippings yellowed with age. "Local mechanic shocks racing world," one headline proclaimed, with a photo of Thomas standing proudly beside his car. Another article, dated a week later, told a different story. "Tragedy at local garage. Mechanic killed in freak accident." There were letters, too. Correspondence between Carmen and racing officials, her polite but insistent inquiries about what happened to Thomas's car, the dismissive responses claiming no evidence of tampering. And at the bottom of the box, in an envelope marked with shaky handwriting, the truth. Inside was a handwritten confession from a man named Harold Beckford, dated 1992, 25 years after Thomas's death. "As I face my maker," the letter began, "I must unburden my soul of the terrible injustice in which I participated." The confession detailed everything Jackson had told Louis: the sabotage of Thomas's car, the cover-up afterward, and the suspicious circumstances of the garage accident. Beckford didn't admit to direct involvement in Thomas's death, but wrote that he always suspected it wasn't an accident. Louis carefully returned everything to the box. With these documents, he could probably create a scandal in the racing world, expose the historical injustice, demand recognition for his grandfather. But would that be what Carmen wanted? She had kept this evidence for decades, without using it. His phone buzzed with a message from his team principal. "Hope all is well. Need to discuss your return. British GP in 3 weeks." Louis stared at the message. The British Grand Prix at Silverstone. His home race. The place where he'd won a record 8 times. The perfect stage for fulfilling Carmen's wish. But there was a problem. His recent form had been terrible. 3 races without a podium. Technical issues plagued his car, and his younger teammate had outqualified him 4 races in a row. The press was starting to whisper that Lewis Hamilton, at 40, might finally be past his prime. Could he win at Silverstone in his current form? The wooden car deserved to be on the top step of the podium, not second or third. Lewis's phone rang. It was his father. "You've been quiet since we looked at those documents," Anthony said when Lewis answered. "Just thinking," Lewis replied, "about what to do with all this." "And what have you decided?" Lewis took a deep breath. "I'm going to win at Silverstone, and I'm going to put Grandpa's car on the podium." There was a pause on the other end of the E line. "Lewis, I know you. When you set your mind to something, you usually achieve it. But you've been struggling lately with the car. Maybe it would be better to wait for a race where—" "No," Lewis cut in firmly. "It has to be Silverstone. Home crowd, home team. It's where it should happen." Anthony sighed. "Your grandmother would say you're being stubborn, just like your grandfather." Is that a bad thing? Lewis asked with a small smile. No, it's what makes you a champion. There was pride in his father's voice now. So, what's the plan? I fly back tomorrow. 3 weeks until the British Grand Prix. I need every minute with the team to sort out our technical issues. And the wooden car? Lewis looked down at the small wooden racer in his hand. It's coming with me, for luck. That night, Lewis couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch of his grandmother's house, just as his grandfather had done the night before his race was stolen from him. The Caribbean night was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, distant music, the gentle crash of waves on the beach. "Chimway, going to do this," Lewis whispered to the wooden car in his palm. "For both of you, I promise." He couldn't know then how difficult keeping that promise would become, or how close he would come to failing. But in that moment, under the stars his grandparents had once wished upon, Lewis Hamilton made a vow that would change the final chapters of his legendary career. The Silverstone circuit basked in rare English sunshine as Lewis drove through the gates 3 days before the British Grand Prix. Normally, arriving at his home track filled him with excitement. The familiar curves of the historic circuit, the memories of past victories, the passionate British fans. But today, his mind was elsewhere. The wooden car sat on the dashboard of his Mercedes road car as he parked in the paddock area. Lewis picked it up and slipped it into the pocket of his team jacket before grabbing his bags. Team members greeted him with subdued smiles. They knew he'd been away for his grandmother's funeral, but Lewis hadn't shared the full story with anyone yet. Behind the polite condolences, he could sense their anxiety. The team hadn't won in 5 races, their longest drought in years. "Good to have you back, Lewis," his team principal said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Ready to get to work?" Lewis nodded firmly. More than ready. In the team's engineering room, a tense atmosphere prevailed. Computer screens displayed data from the previous race, endless charts and graphs that told the story of their recent struggles. Lewis's race engineer, Angela, approached with a tablet in hand. "We've identified the issue with the rear suspension," she explained. "The data shows we're losing downforce in high-speed corners. We've redesigned some components, but... What? Lewis asked, noticing her hesitation. Angela sighed. "But we can only test the changes in simulation. There's no time for real-world testing before qualifying." Lewis frowned. Racing was increasingly about technology and data, but without real-world validation, the changes were basically educated guesses. "Show me the simulations," he said, settling into a chair beside her workstation. For the next 3 hours, Lewis immersed himself in technical details, pushing aside thoughts of wooden cars and family legacies. This was his world now. Milliseconds, gained or lost in computer models, careful adjustments to car setups, endless discussions about tire compounds and fuel loads. As the day wore on, team members drifted away for dinner, but Lewis remained. Something about the suspension simulations didn't feel right. After years of racing, he had developed an intuition that sometimes contradicted what the computers predicted. "You should get some rest," Angela said, returning with coffee. "Tomorrow's going to be busy." Lewis shook his head. "Something's not clicking. The simulation says these changes will help, but my gut says we're missing something." Absent-mindedly, he pulled out the wooden car, turning it over in his fingers as he stared at the screen. "What's that?" Angela asked, noticing the toy for the first time. Lewis hesitated, then decided to tell her. "It belonged to my grandfather. He was a racer too, though he never got the chance to prove it." He explained the story. The sabotaged race in Grenada, his grandmother's wish, his promise to place the car on the podium. Angela listened intently, her eyes widening. That's quite a legacy to carry. Yeah, Lewis agreed quietly. And I need to win this race to do it properly. Not second place, not third, first. He handed her the wooden car. Angela examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands. Your grandfather carved this? She asked, tracing the simple but elegant lines of the wooden vehicle. Lewis nodded. The night before his race, when he was worried someone might sabotage his car. Angela tilted her head, studying the toy more closely. The shape is interesting. Old-fashioned, obviously, but there's something about the way the body curves. She looked up suddenly. Do you mind if I scan this? Scan it? Why? Just a hunch. We have a 3D scanner in the aerodynamics lab. It'll only take a few minutes. Curious, Lewis followed her to another part of the team complex. Angela placed the wooden car on a rotating platform inside a scanning device and closed the door. This will create a digital model we can analyze, she explained, as the machine hummed to life. The wooden car rotated slowly on the platform while lasers mapped every contour. Soon, a detailed 3D model appeared on the monitor. Now, let's run it. Through our aero simulation, Angela said, typing rapidly. Lewis watched in astonishment as the computer analyzed the aerodynamic properties of his grandfather's hand-carved toy. This is incredible, Angela murmured after a few minutes. What is? Lewis leaned closer to the screen. The basic shape. It's actually quite aerodynamically efficient for something carved by hand in the 1960s. Look at this curve here. She pointed to a section of the model. The way it channels airflow, it's similar to a concept we were considering for the rear wing, but we abandoned it because the simulations didn't look promising. Lewis stared at the screen, then at the wooden car, now sitting innocently on the desk. Are you saying my grandfather accidentally carved an aerodynamically advanced race car? Angela smiled. Not accidentally. You said he was a mechanic who worked on cars his whole life, right? He probably had an intuitive understanding of airflow from years of experience. Back then, they didn't have computers to model aerodynamics. They used instinct and observation. An idea began to form in Lewis's mind. Could we adapt this shape for our current design problems? It's unorthodox, Angela admitted. But she turned back to the computer and began overlaying the wooden car's curves onto their current car model, making adjustments. Let me run the simulation again. They waited in tense silence as the computer processed the modified design. When the results appeared, both of them gasped. A 3% improvement in downforce, Angela whispered. That's significant. Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. His grandfather, reaching across more than 5 decades, might have just helped solve their technical problems. We need to show this to the team, he said urgently. The next morning, the engineering room buzzed with activity. Overnight, the aerodynamics team had refined the concept inspired by Thomas Hamilton's wooden car. The manufacturing department was already producing prototype parts based on the new design. It's a gamble, the technical director warned. We haven't properly tested these modifications. Sometimes you have to trust more than just data, Lewis replied, the wooden car now a constant presence in his pocket. By the time the first practice session began on Friday morning, Lewis's car featured subtle modifications to its rear wing and floor design, changes inspired by a toy carved on a Grenadian porch in 1967. As Lewis pulled out of the pits for his first lap, he patted his pocket where the wooden car sat. "Let's see what you've got, Grandpa," he whispered. The car felt different immediately, more planted in the high-speed corners where they had been struggling. Lap after lap, Lewis pushed harder, feeling the car respond in a way it hadn't for months. When he finally returned to the pits, the team was gathered around the timing screens with expressions of disbelief. P1, Angela told him, grinning. Fastest time by half a second. For the first time since arriving at Silverstone, Lewis allowed himself to hope. Perhaps fulfilling his promise wouldn't be impossible after all. The mood in the Mercedes garage was cautiously optimistic on Saturday morning. Lewis's strong showing in practice had boosted the team's spirits, but everyone knew that practice times didn't always translate to qualifying success. Weather forecast is changing, Angela informed Lewis as he arrived at the track. They're predicting rain during qualifying. Lewis nodded, glancing up at the darkening clouds gathering over Silverstone. Rain could change everything, creating opportunities but also multiplying risks. How do the modifications hold up in wet conditions? He asked. The simulations look good, Angela replied, but we haven't had a chance to test them in real rain. Lewis patted the pocket where the wooden car sat. Since his grandfather had carved it on a Caribbean island where sudden tropical downpours were common, perhaps it would perform well in the English rain too. The final practice session went smoothly, with Lewis setting the second fastest time behind his rival, Max Verstappen. The Red Bull driver had dominated the championship this season, but for the first time in months, the gap between them had narrowed to mere hundredths of a second. As qualifying approached, the sky grew increasingly threatening. Fans in the grandstands hurriedly donned rain ponchos and opened umbrellas. The teams scrambled to adjust their strategies, preparing both slick tires for the dry track and intermediate tires for when the rain inevitably arrived. The radar shows a heavy cell moving in, Mercedes' weather expert reported, likely to hit during Q2. Lewis sat quietly in his driver room, holding his grandfather's wooden car, mentally preparing for the challenging conditions ahead. Rain at Silverstone was particularly treacherous due to the circuit's high speeds and the way water pooled at certain corners. When it was time, Lewis walked to his car, his face set with determination beneath his helmet. The wooden car went into the small compartment beside his seat, where drivers kept personal items. "Good luck out there," Angela said through his radio as he pulled out of the garage. "Remember, we just need to get through to Q3, then we can fight for pole." Q1 passed without incident. The track remained dry, and Lewis easily advanced to the second qualifying session with the third fastest time. But as the cars lined up to start Q2, the first drops of rain began to fall. "Rain at turn 7, one driver reported over the radio. "More rain at the start line now," another added. The teams faced a critical decision: start the session on slick tires for maximum performance on the mostly dry track, then switch to intermediates as conditions worsened, or play it safe with intermediates from the beginning, sacrificing some performance but reducing risk. "What do you think?" Angela asked Lewis. "Let's go with slicks," he decided after a moment's consideration. "The track temperature is still high. We can get a quick lap in before it gets too wet." It was a calculated gamble. As Lewis began his flying lap, he could see darker patches on the track where rain was falling more heavily, but the racing line remained mostly dry. He pushed hard through the first sector, the car responding beautifully despite the tricky conditions. "Sector 1 is purple," Angela informed him, meaning he had set the fastest first sector time of any driver. Lewis smiled beneath his helmet. The modifications inspired by his grandfather's wooden car were clearly working. He felt connected to Thomas Hamilton as he guided the Mercedes through Silverstone's famous sequences of fast corners. But as he approached the high-speed Maggots and Beckett's complex, disaster struck. A sudden, heavy shower had drenched this section of the track. As Lewis turned in at over 170 mph, his slick tires lost grip on the wet surface. The car snapped sideways, becoming instantly uncontrollable. Lewis fought the steering wheel, trying to correct the slide, but physics was against him. The Mercedes spun across the runoff area and slammed sideways into the barrier with a sickening crunch of carbon fiber. The impact forced the air from Lewis's lungs. For a moment, he sat stunned in the wrecked car as rain pattered on his helmet. Then his training kicked in, and he quickly switched off the engine and removed the steering wheel. "Lewis, are you okay?" Angela's worried voice came through the radio. "I'm fine," he replied, climbing out of the car to wave at the concerned crowd. But as he stood in the rain, looking at the crumpled remains of his Mercedes, Lewis felt a wave of despair. The car was severely damaged, the entire left side crushed. Suspension components broken, bodywork shredded, and worse, his qualifying was over. With 16 drivers yet to set times in Q2, Lewis would almost certainly start the race from the very back of the grid. As the marshals led him away from the wreckage, Lewis reached into the car to retrieve his grandfather's wooden toy, at least that had survived unscathed. Back in the garage, the team gathered around screens showing the damage. The technical director's face was grim as he assessed the situation. "How bad is it?" Lewis asked, though he already knew the answer. "We'll need to rebuild the entire left side," the technical director replied. "New chassis, new suspension, new everything. It's going to be a long night." Lewis stared at the wooden car in his hand. Starting from the back of the grid at Silverstone, with a hastily rebuilt car, his promise to win suddenly seemed impossible to keep. Race day dawned bright and clear over Silverstone. The previous day's rain had washed the air clean, leaving behind a brilliantly blue sky. Under normal circumstances, Lewis would have appreciated the perfect racing weather. Today, it felt like mockery. He had barely slept. After leaving the track well past midnight, once he was certain the team had everything they needed to rebuild his car, Lewis had tossed and turned in his motorhome, his mind racing with scenarios of how to recover from 20th position. Now, as he walked through the paddock toward the Mercedes garage, fans called his name and offered words of encouragement. "You can do it, Lewis. We believe in you. Biggest comeback ever today." Lewis waved and smiled, though his heart wasn't in it. The British fans were always supportive, but even their faith couldn't change the brutal mathematics of Formula One. Starting from the back at a track like Silverstone, where overtaking was challenging, the possibility of winning seemed remote at best. When he reached the garage, Lewis was surprised to find the entire team gathered, looking not defeated, but determined. His car sat ready, completely rebuilt overnight, its silver and teal paintwork gleaming under the lights. "How bad is it?" Lewis asked Angela, bracing himself for news of compromises they'd had to make in the rushed rebuild. "It's not bad at all," she replied with a smile. "In fact, it might be better than before." The technical director stepped forward. "We took the opportunity to implement some additional changes based on the wooden car design. Since we had to rebuild, anyway, we pushed the concept further." Lewis raised his eyebrows. "Is that legal?" "Completely. We're still within the homologated design parameters. We've just optimized some areas we were conservative with before. For the first time since his crash, Lewis felt a flicker of hope. He pulled the wooden car from his pocket, studying its simple lines once more before carefully placing it in the compartment beside his seat. The pre-race briefing was unusually short. The strategy was clear: an aggressive start to gain positions. Early, then a long first stint on hard tires while others pitted, hoping to capitalize on any safety cars or changing conditions. "The weather forecast is stable," the strategist explained. but there's a small chance of a rain shower around lap 40. Nothing certain, just a possibility. Lewis nodded, thinking of his grandfather waiting through the night before his race, carving the wooden car while watching for signs of rain. Perhaps history had a way of echoing. As the clock ticked toward the race start, Lewis went through his usual routine, stretching, visualization, a quiet moment of focus. But today, he added something new. He found a private corner of the garage, held the wooden car in his palm, and closed his eyes. "I know this seems impossible," he whispered, "but I made a promise. Help me find a way." Whether he was speaking to his grandparents or simply to himself, Lewis wasn't entirely sure. But when he opened his eyes, he felt calmer, more centered. The mountain ahead still loomed large, but he was ready to begin climbing. The driver's parade gave Lewis a chance to gauge the mood of his competitors. Verstappen looked confident, having secured pole position. Lewis's teammate was tense, starting from third. The Ferrari drivers were animated, discussing strategy. None of them paid much attention to Lewis. The veteran champion starting from the back was not considered a threat today. That suited Lewis fine. Being underestimated could work to his advantage. Finally, it was time. Lewis settled into his rebuilt car, going through the complex startup sequence with his engineers. The wooden car sat securely beside him, a talisman connecting past and present. "Radio check, Lewis?" Angela's voice came through his headset. "Loud and clear," he replied. "Just to confirm our strategy. We're looking for a strong start, careful, tire management, and keeping our options open. The car should be strong in race trim." "Understood. And, Angela, thank you. All of you, for last night." "Just doing our jobs," she replied, but Lewis could hear the smile in her voice. "Go make it worth it." As the cars formed up on the grid, Lewis at the very back, the enormity of his challenge became clear. 19 cars stood between him and victory. 19 cars piloted by the best drivers in the world, all determined not to give an inch. The key formation lap began, a slow procession around the circuit to warm tires and brakes. Lewis focused on getting perfect temperature into his tires. Starting from the back, he'd need every possible advantage when the lights went out. Back on the grid, the tension mounted. Lewis adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the 5 red lights above the start line. His world narrowed to those lights, his breathing slow and measured. 1 light, 2, 3, 4, 5. A moment of perfect stillness. Lights out. Lewis's reaction was instantaneous. As the clutch engaged, the Mercedes leaped forward, the engine's roar filling his helmet. The start was critical, his only chance to gain multiple positions before the field spread out. Ahead, several cars got bogged down with wheel spin. Lewis threaded his way through, picking his line carefully but decisively. 3 cars passed before the first corner, 2 more through the tight complex that followed. "Great start, Lewis!" Angela's voice was excited. In his ear, "You're already P15!" But Lewis wasn't satisfied. As they approached the high-speed section where he'd crashed in qualifying, he spotted an opportunity. 2 cars ahead were battling side by side, slowing each other down. With perfect timing, Lewis darted past both of them in a single bold move. By the end of the first lap, Lewis had climbed to 13th place, 7 positions gained. An extraordinary start, but still nowhere near what he needed. "Tire temps good, gaps looking promising," Angela reported. "Keep pushing." Lap after lap, Lewis fought for every position. His rebuilt car felt strong, the aerodynamic changes giving him an advantage in the fast corners. By lap 10, he had battled his way up to 7th place, but the leaders were disappearing into the distance. Verstappen had already built a 5-second gap to 2nd place. Lewis was nearly 30 seconds behind the lead, a gap that seemed insurmountable under normal racing conditions. "Box this lap, box this lap," came the call to the Ferrari ahead of Lewis. One by one, the cars on softer tire compounds began pitting, creating opportunities. "How are the tires?" Angela asked. "Still good," Lewis replied, feeling the perfect balance of his car. "I can keep going." By lap 20, Lewis had climbed to 4th place as others pitted. But those on fresh tires were catching rapidly from behind. The question was whether he could build enough of a gap to maintain position after his own inevitable pit stop. That's when Lewis noticed the first dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Weather update," Angela's voice came through Lewis's headset. "Rain expected in approximately 15 minutes. Light at first, possibly getting heavier." Lewis felt a surge of adrenaline. Rain was the great equalizer in Formula One, reducing the advantage of the fastest cars and placing greater emphasis on driver skill. If there was a path to victory from his position, rain might create it. "Understood," he replied calmly, though his mind was racing with calculations. "What's the gap to Verstappen?" 24 seconds to the lead. P3 is 8 seconds ahead of you. Not impossible, but still a mountain to climb. Lewis focused on maintaining his pace while preserving his tires. If he timed his pit stop perfectly with the arrival of rain, he might leapfrog multiple positions. In the meantime, cars on fresh tires were catching him. Lewis defended against a Williams, then a McLaren, giving up as little time as possible, while avoiding unnecessary battles that would burn his tires. "5 cars behind you are catching at half a second per lap," Angela warned. "Verstappen is pitting now." Lewis watched in his mirrors as the Red Bull driver emerged from the pit lane. On fresh medium tires, the race leader had opted for slicks, despite the threatening sky, a statement of confidence that the rain would hold off long enough to make another stop for wet tires later. "What's your feeling on the weather, Lewis?" Angela asked. Lewis studied the darkening clouds, remembering countless rainy races throughout his career. "It's coming sooner than they think," he replied. "Get the inters ready." Lap after lap, Lewis nursed his aging hard tires, feeling them gradually lose grip. The gap to the cars behind was shrinking rapidly. He would need to pit soon, rain or no rain. Then, as he rounded Kopp's Corner, one of Silverstone's fastest turns, Lewis felt it. A few scattered drops hitting his visor. Within seconds, those drops multiplied. "Rain at Kopp's," he reported. "Still light, but the track will be slippery." "Box this lap," came the immediate response. "Inters ready." As Lewis approached the pit entry, the rain intensified. Perfect timing. He dived into the pit lane, the team ready with intermediate tires, grooved, to disperse water while still providing grip in mixed conditions. The pit stop was flawless. 2.1 seconds and back on track. But what happened during those 2.1 seconds transformed the race. The rain suddenly hammered down, catching many teams by surprise. "Multiple cars staying out," Angela informed him excitedly. "They're gambling. It's just a passing shower." Lewis knew better. This was not a passing shower, but the leading edge of the weather system they'd been tracking. And now he had the right tires for the conditions while others, including Verstappen, were struggling on slicks. The difference was immediately apparent. As Lewis rounded the first corners on his intermediate tires, he was gaining 3 to 4 seconds per lap on the cars ahead, trying to survive on slicks. It was like they were driving on ice while he had proper grip. One by one, those ahead recognized their error and dived for the pits, but the damage was done. In the chaos of quickly deteriorating conditions, Lewis found himself in third place, then second, as others pitted desperately for wet tires. Only Verstappen remained ahead, the championship leader gambling one more lap on slicks to minimize time loss. It was one lap too many. As Lewis powered through the rain, now falling heavily across the entire circuit, he caught a glimpse of red and blue spinning across the track ahead. Verstappen had finally lost control, his slick tires unable to cope with the deluge. The Red Bull slid gracefully across the gravel trap and tapped the barrier. Not a heavy impact, but enough to damage the front wing. Lewis carefully navigated past the stricken Red Bull as it limped toward the pits. Suddenly, incredibly, he was leading the British Grand Prix. "You're P1, Lewis." Angela's voice was jubilant. "Verstappen is pitting for a new front wing and enters. Gap is approximately 12 seconds. Lewis allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, but knew the race was far from won. The rain was now falling so heavily that visibility was becoming a serious issue. Spray from cars ahead created a white wall that required extreme concentration to navigate. "Blue flags for back markers ahead," came the warning from Angela. Lapping slower cars would be particularly treacherous in these conditions. For the next 10 laps, Lewis focused entirely on survival, finding the areas of the track with the best grip, carefully passing back markers, maintaining the gap to those behind. The wooden car sat securely in its compartment, somehow a comforting presence as Lewis battled the elements. Then, just as he was settling into a rhythm, a new challenge emerged. "Lewis, we're concerned about the intermediate tires," Angela's voice had a note of worry now. "They're wearing quickly in these conditions. We think the track might be wet enough for full wets." Lewis felt the car beginning to slide more frequently as the tread on his intermediate tires wore down. But switching to full wet tires was a significant decision. If the rain eased, those tires would overheat and disintegrate rapidly. "What are the others doing?" he asked. "Mixed strategies. Some staying on inters, some going to wets. Verstappen is closing the gap on fresh inters. 10 seconds now, and gaining about a second per lap." Lewis had to make a decision: pit for fresh tires and potentially lose the lead, or stay out and risk disaster if his current tires failed completely. He thought of his grandfather, forced to make impossible choices with limited information. Thomas Hamilton had stood his ground, against pressure and intimidation. Perhaps it was time for his grandson to show similar courage. "I'm staying out," Lewis declared firmly. "These tires still have life in them." "Lewis, are you sure?" Angela sounded concerned. "The team recommends pitting. The wear indicators are critical." "I can feel the car," Lewis insisted. "Trust me." There was a pause, then, "Understood. It's your call." The next 5 laps were among the most challenging of Lewis's career. The intermediate tires were worn nearly to slicks, providing minimal water dispersion. Every corner became a calculated risk. The gap to Verstappen continued to shrink. 8 seconds, then 6, then 4. With 10 laps remaining, Lewis's decision began to look catastrophic. Verstappen loomed large in his mirrors, the Red Bull's fresh intermediate tires clearly superior in the continuing rain. 3-second gap, Angela reported tensely. "He'll be within DRS range next lap." Lewis gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting the car through every corner. The worn intermediates were barely hanging on, but there was something else happening. The racing line was beginning to dry slightly as cars repeatedly passed over it. In these evolving conditions, his worn tires were finding unexpected grip on the drying line. "Weather update," came Angela's voice again. "Rain easing. Forecast shows. It should stop completely within 5 laps." Lewis smiled beneath his helmet. Sometimes, the riskiest decisions were the right ones after all. As Verstappen closed to within 1 second, ready to activate his DRS for an overtaking attempt, Lewis suddenly found another gear. His worn tires, now essentially slicks with some grooves, were perfect for the emerging conditions. Not dry enough for proper slicks, not wet enough for fresh intermediates. "Gap stabilizing at 1 second," Angela reported, surprise evident in her voice. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." For the next 5 laps, Lewis and Verstappen danced around Silverstone, separated by the narrowest of margins. Every time the Red Bull got close enough to attempt a pass, Lewis positioned his car perfectly, finding traction where there seemed to be none. With 5 laps to go, the rain stopped completely. The track began drying rapidly in patches, creating a patchwork of grip that required instinctive adaptation corner by corner. This was no longer about the cars, but about the drivers, their feel, their judgment, their courage. In these conditions, Lewis Hamilton was still the master. 5 laps to go, Angela's voice crackled through the radio. Verstappen, still within DRS range. Lewis could see the Red Bull looming in his mirrors, its blue and red livery menacing against the gradually brightening sky. The rain had stopped, but the track remained treacherous, wet in some sections, developing a dry line in others. It was the most challenging type of condition for any driver. "Tire temperatures?" Lewis asked, feeling the car sliding slightly more each lap. "Critical on the rears," came the response. "Everyone's struggling. It's the same for Verstappen." As they started the 4th-to-last lap, Verstappen made his move. With DRS open on the Wellington Straight, the Red Bull pulled alongside the Mercedes. Lewis defended the inside line into Brooklands, forcing Verstappen to take the longer route around. The outside. Side by side, they raced through the corner, inches apart, neither yielding. Lewis felt his worn tires losing grip, but held his nerve. As they exited the corner, Verstappen had to back off slightly, giving Lewis a moment's breathing room. "He's faster in Sector 1, Angela reported. "You're stronger in Sector 3. 2 more cars to lap before the finish." Lewis nodded inside his helmet. Lapping back markers could either help him by breaking Verstappen's momentum or hinder him if he got held up. Everything would depend on where they encountered these slower cars. As they started the 3rd-to-last lap, Lewis felt something shift in his pocket. The wooden car had moved with the motion of the Mercedes through the corners. For a split second, it felt almost as if his grandfather was helping him steer, a presence alongside him in the cockpit. Verstappen attacked again, this time into the ultra-fast Copse corner. It was an ambitious move, requiring absolute precision from both drivers. Lewis held his line, giving just enough space to avoid contact, but not a millimeter more. Once again, they emerged with Lewis narrowly ahead. 2 laps to go, Angela announced, tension evident in her voice. First back marker, at the end of this lap. As they approached Abbey, the first of the corners that made up Silverstone's high-speed section, Lewis spotted the back marker ahead, a green Aston Martin moving much slower than the leaders. The timing was critical. If Lewis passed before the complex section, Verstappen might use the back marker's slipstream to gain an advantage. Lewis made a split-second decision, briefly backing off to ensure he would catch the Aston Martin at precisely the right moment, in the middle of the corner sequence where overtaking was nearly impossible. Verstappen, sensing Lewis's strategy, tried to close the gap quickly, but it was too late. Lewis navigated past the back marker with practiced efficiency, while Verstappen lost crucial tenths getting through the traffic. The gap extended to just over a second, enough to break the DRS range temporarily. "Brilliant, Lewis!" Angela exclaimed. "One more lap." The final lap. Everything Lewis had fought for, the extraordinary climb from 20th position, the strategic gamble in the rain, the defense against Verstappen, came down to these final 3.6 miles of Silverstone circuit. The gap was shrinking again. Verstappen, freed from the back marker, was charging hard. Lewis could see the determination in his rival's driving. The slightly later braking, the more aggressive lines through corners, the absolute commitment. "Last back marker approaching Stowe," Angela warned. Lewis's heart sank slightly. Stowe was one of Verstappen's strongest corners, where the Red Bull's superior downforce gave him an advantage. If Lewis got delayed there, the race could slip away in the final moments. As they approached the back marker, a white Williams struggling for grip on the still damp track, Lewis made another crucial decision. Instead of following the developing dry line, he moved to the inside, taking a line still wet but offering a cleaner pass around the Williams. It was risky, requiring perfect judgment of grip on the wetter surface. Lewis felt the car slide slightly, but he maintained control with microscopic steering adjustments. The Williams driver, seeing the leaders approaching, moved aside as efficiently as possible. Lewis emerged still in the lead, but Verstappen had closed to within half a second. "Final sector, Lewis. Keep it clean." The wooden car shifted again in its compartment as they entered the series of corners that would decide the race. Lewis imagined his grandfather watching, perhaps with Carmen beside him somewhere beyond this world, willing their grandson to victory. Verstappen made his final attack at Club Corner, the last real overtaking opportunity. The Red Bull dived to the inside, forcing Lewis to either cede position or risk contact. For a heartbeat, Lewis considered the safe option. Take second place, still a podium, still a chance to fulfill at least part of his grandmother's wish. But that wasn't what Thomas Hamilton would have done. His grandfather had refused to back down even when threatened. He had insisted on racing on his own terms. Lewis held his line. For a moment, disaster seemed certain. The cars were converging too quickly, neither driver yielding. Then, with millimeter precision, Lewis adjusted his line just enough to avoid contact while maintaining the racing line for the exit. Verstappen, forced to take the tighter line, lost crucial momentum as they powered onto the start-finish straight. For the final time, Lewis held a car length's advantage. The checkered flag waved as Lewis crossed the line, first by 0.2 of a second. The crowd erupted, a roar so loud it penetrated even through his helmet and the engine noise. "Get in there, Lewis!" Angela screamed over the radio. "You've done it! P20 to P1. Absolutely incredible." Lewis punched the air as he began his cool-down lap, emotions overwhelming him. The impossible climb from the back of the grid, the rebuilt car, the perfect strategy call in the rain, the defensive masterclass against Verstappen, and most of all, the promise kept. As he savored the moment, Lewis patted the compartment containing the wooden car. "We did it, Grandpa," he whispered. "We finished what couldn't be finished." The team lined the pit wall as Lewis crossed the line to complete his victory lap, their faces showing a mixture of jubilation and disbelief. He parked the car in the EB2E designated area for the top 3 finishers and sat for a moment, gathering himself. When Lewis finally climbed out, removing his helmet, the cameras caught what millions of viewers would later describe as one of the most emotional moments in E3 Formula One history. The 7-time world champion, known for his composure, had tears streaming down his face. In his hand was a small wooden object, that no one yet recognized. As the British national anthem played, Lewis looked upward, the wooden car clutched tightly in his palm. Soon he would place it on the top step of the podium, fulfilling Carmen's final wish. But for now, this moment was between him and his grandparents, a private triumph spanning generations. The greatest comeback in Lewis Hamilton's illustrious career was about to become something even more, a family legacy finally completing its journey. 60 years after it began on a small Caribbean island, where a mechanic dared to dream of racing glory. The cool-down room, where the top 3 finishers gathered before the podium ceremony, buzzed with tension. Verstappen sat silently, still processing how victory had slipped away in the final corners. The Ferrari driver who'd finished third chatted excitedly about the changing conditions. Lewis barely heard them. The wooden car felt warm in his palm, as if alive with its own energy. He'd carried it from Grenada to Monaco to Silverstone, and now, finally, to the threshold of its destiny. A Formula One official poked her head in. "Podium in 2 minutes, gentlemen." Outside, the Silverstone crowd roared in anticipation. Over 140,000 British fans had witnessed one of the greatest drives in Formula One history, their champion rising from last place to victory in dramatic fashion. None of them yet knew the deeper significance of what they were about to see. "Quite a drive," Verstappen said suddenly, breaking his silence. "From P20 to beating me by 2/10. Not many could do that." "Thanks," Lewis replied, genuine appreciation in his voice despite their fierce rivalry. It was all about the changing conditions. "And the driver," Verstappen added with a respectful nod. The official returned. "Gentlemen, we're ready for you." Lewis tucked the wooden car into the pocket of his race suit. Its moment would come soon. The 3 drivers stepped onto the podium. The crowd's cheers reached deafening levels. Union Jack flags waved throughout the grandstands. Lewis had won at Silverstone 8 times before, but this, his 9th victory at his home circuit, clearly meant something special to the fans. If only they knew how special it truly was. The 3rd-place trophy was presented first, then second to Verstappen. Finally, the race winner's trophy, a beautiful silver cup with the Silverstone circuit layout etched around its base, was presented to Lewis. As the British national anthem began to play, Lewis held the trophy aloft with one hand. With his other, he discreetly reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden car. The cameras, focused on his face and the trophy, didn't catch this small movement. When the anthem concluded, Lewis looked down at the small wooden object in his palm. 60 years of history, of dreams deferred, of quiet courage in the face of injustice, all contained in this humble carving. Lewis placed the trophy on the podium step. Then, with deliberate care, he set the wooden car beside it. The TV director, noticing this unusual action, instructed a camera operator to zoom in. Suddenly, on screens around the world, viewers saw a close-up of the small wooden racing car with the number 44 painted on its side. "What's that, Lewis?" the podium interviewer asked, noticing the wooden car as he approached for the post-race interview. Lewis picked up the wooden car again, holding it so the cameras could clearly see it. His voice, when he spoke, was steady despite the emotion evident on his face. "This belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Hamilton. He was a mechanic and a racer in Grenada in the 1960s. Lewis paused, gathering himself. He carved this, the night, before what should have been the biggest race of his life, a race he never got to start because his car was sabotaged. A hush fell over the crowd as they sensed the importance of what Lewis was sharing. My grandmother Carmen kept this all these years. Before she passed away recently, she asked me to place it on the podium, to give my grandfather the victory. He was denied. The interviewer, caught off guard by this unexpected story, simply said, That's incredible, Lewis." Lewis nodded, tears welling in his eyes again. "My grandfather never got to race that day. But today, 60 years later, his car finally finished first. He kissed the wooden car gently and placed it back on the top step of the podium, where cameras lingered on it as champagne was brought out for the traditional celebration. As the three drivers shook their bottles, Lewis gestured to Verstappen and the Ferrari driver to wait. He picked up the wooden car one more time, protecting it from the spray that would soon come. "My grandfather would have wanted this to stay dry," he explained with a smile, tucking it safely back into his pocket. Then, the celebration began in tutti, earnest, champagne spraying in all directions, the crowd cheering wildly, photographers capturing the joy and relief on Lewis's face. But the most powerful image, the small wooden car beside the winner's trophy, had already been broadcast to millions. Later, in the press conference, journalists asked for more details about Thomas Hamilton and the wooden car. Lewis shared the story in full: the Caribbean Grand Prix of 1967, the qualification in first position, the officials who came to the house, the sabotage, and the suspicious accident that claimed his grandfather's life a week later. "Today wasn't just a race for me," Lewis explained. "It was about correcting a wrong that happened long before I was born. My grandmother kept this story private most of her life to protect me from feeling burdened by it. She only revealed it before she passed away." One journalist asked if Lewis planned to pursue official recognition of what happened to his grandfather. "I'm not sure yet," Lewis replied thoughtfully. "My grandmother kept evidence, newspaper clippings, even a confession from one of the officials, years later. But today wasn't about seeking justice or making accusations. It was about fulfilling a promise and honoring my family's legacy." As Lewis left the circuit that evening, crowds of fans still lined his path, many now holding hastily made signs referencing 2 generations of Hamilton racers. Word of the wooden car and its significance had spread rapidly through social media and news reports. Back in his hotel room, Lewis called his father. "It's done," he said simply, when Anthony answered. "I saw," his father replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom would have been so proud. Dad, too." "I felt them with me today," Lewis admitted, "especially in those final laps. It was like Grandpa was helping me drive." "Maybe he was," Anthony said softly. After they hung up, Lewis placed the wooden car on his nightstand. In the morning, he would need to decide what to do with it, and with the evidence of the injustice his grandfather had suffered. But for tonight, it had served its purpose. Thomas Hamilton's car had finally crossed a finish line in first place. A promise had been kept. A circle had been completed. And Lewis Hamilton, with 104 Grand Prix victories to his name, had just secured what might be the most meaningful win of his career. Not for himself, but for the grandfather he had never known, and the grandmother who had connected them across time. Outside his window, fireworks burst over Silverstone, celebrating a victory that meant far more than anyone had realized when the race began. Only Lewis knew the full story, at least for now. Soon, the world would understand why his eyes had filled with tears on that podium, and why a small wooden car had shared his moment of triumph. Morning sunlight streamed through the hotel curtains, waking Lewis gently. For a moment, he lay still, the events of the previous day washing over him. The crash in qualifying, the rebuilding of his car, the incredible race from last to first. And finally, the wooden car taking its place on the podium. His phone buzzed continuously on the nightstand. Notifications had been pouring in all night. Messages from friends and fellow drivers, news alerts about his victory, and social media exploding with the story of Thomas Hamilton's wooden car. Lewis reached past the phone and picked up the wooden car, studying it in the morning light. Now that his grandmother's wish had been fulfilled, he needed to decide what to do with it. And with the blue box of evidence still waiting at Carmen's house in Grenada. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his press officer, looking both excited and concerned. "Morning, Lewis. The story about your grandfather has gone viral. Every news outlet wants an exclusive interview, and the Formula One Historical Society has already reached out." Lewis nodded, unsurprised. "Tell them I'll make a statement after I've had some time to think." "There's something else," the press officer added hesitantly. "A journalist from Grenada today is claiming they have documents about your grandfather's case. Something about a government official being involved in the sabotage. They're planning to publish later today." Lewis felt a chill. The story was taking on a life of its own, moving faster than he could control. Soon, people would be digging into the events of 1967, perhaps with less care and respect than the situation deserved. After his press officer left, Lewis called Jackson in Grenada, hoping the old man might provide some guidance. "I saw the race," Jackson said when he answered, pride evident in his voice. "Thomas would have driven just like that, never giving an inch. You've got his spirit, no doubt about it." "The story's spreading, Jackson, about what happened to Grandpa. Soon everyone will be talking about it, investigating it." The old man was silent for a moment. "Perhaps it's time. Truth has a way of finding the light, even after all these years. What should I do with the evidence? With the confession?" "That's for you to decide," Jackson replied. "Carmen kept it hidden to protect the family, but she gave it to you for a reason. She trusted your judgment." After they hung up, Lewis called his father next. Anthony Hamilton had returned to England the previous day but hadn't attended the race, watching instead from Carmen's house with other family members. "I've been thinking about the blue box," Lewis told him. "About making the confession public." His father sighed heavily. "It's complicated, Lewis. Some of those officials' families are still prominent in Grenada. There could be consequences, legal challenges, damaged reputations. But Grandpa deserves justice," Lewis argued. "The truth deserves to be known." "Does it?" Anthony's voice was gentle. "Your grandfather was a proud man who loved racing for pure reasons. Would he want his legacy to be defined by bitterness and controversy, or by inspiration?" The question lingered with Lewis as he prepared for his day. His phone continued to buzz with messages, including one from a prestigious automobile museum requesting the wooden car for a display on racing history. By afternoon, Lewis had been called to the team factory for a debrief on the race. The engineers were ecstatic about the performance of the modifications inspired by the wooden car's design. "We've analyzed the data," Angela explained, showing him charts on her computer. "The aerodynamic changes gave us exactly the advantage we needed in those wet-to-dry conditions. It's revolutionary in a way, so simple yet effective." Lewis smiled at the irony. His grandfather, denied his chance to race, had inadvertently contributed to one of the most significant victories in the Formula One history. "We'd like to continue developing this concept," Angela continued. "With your permission, of course, since it came from your grandfather's design." "I think he'd like that," Lewis replied. His ideas finally making a difference in racing, even after all these years. That evening, alone in his apartment in Monaco, Lewis finally opened the full letter from his grandmother again. He'd been so focused on the wooden car and the race that he hadn't properly absorbed Carmen's deeper message. The final page contained words he'd skimmed over before. "Lewis, whatever you decide to do with the evidence, remember that your grandfather didn't race for recognition or for revenge. He raced because it brought him joy, the pure joy of pushing limits and finding freedom in speed. That same joy shines in you when you race. Don't let old injustices dim that light. Some truths set us free when spoken. Others only lead to more pain. Trust your heart to know the difference. All my love, Grandma Carmen. Louis set the letter down and glanced at the wooden car on his coffee table. He thought of Thomas Hamilton working through the night, carefully carving this token of his dreams as he faced the threat of sabotage. What would his grandfather want? Justice that might reopen old wounds and create new conflicts? Or something more healing? The answer came to Louis in a dream that night. He was back at the abandoned Grenada racing circuit, but it was restored to its former glory. His grandfather stood beside a vintage race car, wearing overalls similar to Louis's own racing suit. Carmen was there too, young and beautiful, as in the old photographs. "You did it, boy," Thomas said in the dream, his voice somehow familiar, though Louis had never heard it. "You crossed the finish line for both of us." "But what about the confession?" Louis asked. "Don't you want people to know what they did to you?" Thomas shook his head. "That's the past. What matters is what you've created for the future." When Louis woke, his path was clear. He wouldn't bury the truth, but he wouldn't use it as a weapon either. There was a middle way that honored both justice and healing. A week later, Louis announced his decision. He would donate the wooden car to the Formula One Hall of Fame, along with a carefully curated exhibition telling Thomas Hamilton's story. The confession letter and other evidence would be included, presented not as an accusation but as historical documentation of the obstacles minority drivers faced. "My grandfather's dream wasn't about revenge," Louis explained at the press conference. "It was about racing, about the pure joy of competition and the freedom found in pushing boundaries. By sharing his story, I hope to inspire other young drivers who might face similar barriers today." The exhibition, titled Unfinished Race: The Thomas Hamilton Story, opened 3 months later. It became one of the most visited displays in racing history, drawing attention to both historical injustices and the progress still needed in the sport. As for the wooden car itself, it sat in a place of honor at the center of the exhibit, beside photographs of both Thomas and Carmen Hamilton. A small plaque beneath it read simply, "Some races take generations to finish, but with courage and perseverance, the checkered flag awaits us all." At the season's final race in Abu Dhabi, Louis secured his 8th World Championship, breaking the all-time record. For this special occasion, he wore a custom helmet, Carmen's face painted on one side, Thomas's on the other. The wooden car was no longer with him physically, but as Louis stood on the championship podium, he felt his grandparents' presence more strongly than ever. Together, they had finished what once seemed impossible to finish. Thank you so much for listening to this emotional journey of family legacy, racing passion, and promises fulfilled across generations. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to know which part of the world this story reached. If you enjoyed this heartfelt tale about Louis Hamilton honoring his grandfather's legacy, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories just like this one. Every subscription helps us continue creating content that touches hearts and spreads positive messages. Don't forget to share this video with friends and family who might need a touching story today. By sharing, you're helping spread kindness and awareness about overcoming obstacles and honoring those who came before us. Until our next story, take care and remember that sometimes the most meaningful victories aren't just about ourselves, but about completing journeys that others couldn't finish.